There we are. Okay, we'll go ahead and call the Stationary Source Committee to order, and Joe will check our attorneys to make sure they're in good standing. Nothing against you guys, he made a statement. Yeah. We'll move on to the first item, the non-attainment for New Source Review Compliance Demonstration for the 2008 Ozone Standard. Michael, go ahead.
Thank you, Chairman. I'll just keep this brief. Basically what we're doing here is it's an administrative procedure to comply with EPA's finding of failure to submit a non-attainment NSR demonstration. Now, we did believe, however, that we were in compliance with this requirement. Again, this is as the Clean Air Act requirement, because we do have a federally approved NSR program. However, EPA's response to that was they wanted more of a detailed demonstration of each of those requirements, and they also wanted the board to certify that demonstration. So basically, that's what we're doing here, and we're proceeding to go to the board in June. There is a presentation, but you can't really go into the details.
All right.
Plus, I want to make sure I get in this time.
Thank you. Boy, if I'd known it would have been that short last time, maybe we'll let you in. No, we were too late last time even for this. Anyone have any questions on this item?
Well, this says that Barbara Baird is good standing with the bar.
She reviewed it.
I didn't know your middle name was Beth, but now I do.
Now everyone knows.
BBB?
Yeah, BBB.
Wow.
There you go.
This is an information item. I assume in the board package we'll have all the information because we didn't actually, you didn't include all the stuff that went into the analysis, right?
I believe it was attached, but okay.
No, it was not what I received.
Okay.
It's
information. Okay, yeah.
Lockie's saying there's going to be more information in the board package. That's
Yes,
all I
we
wanted
do have
to make sure.
Sorry about that. Okay, yes. We will get that.
Any other questions? Any public comment on this item? Very good. All right, we'll move on to the next item.
Okay, this is also an administrative procedure. This is to demonstrate that both our 2010 and 2015 Reclaim Amendment Program meets Clean Air Act's RACT requirements. And again, this is something else that they're requesting. As you know, according to the Health and Safety Code, our Reclaim program is supposed to meet already BACT levels. So because we've, all the enjoyment of the last couple of years on that. But as we know, RACT is less stringent than BARC, so meeting those BARC standards would already, should automatically comply. But we went through a full demonstration for EPA. The issue here, though, is timing, okay? Because one of the findings has already started a sanction clock, and that does get triggered in November. So it's really critical for us to kind of move this item along. This does need to get approved by ARB and move it on to EPA. So we are going through what is called a parallel process, upon which we'll be submitting this package in parallel to both those agencies. So they're ready to get their approval process happening and in a timely manner.
Very good. Any questions, anyone? Any public comment on this item? All right, very good. Thank you, and
Thank you very much.
I'm going to note the fact that you actually stayed under those 5 minutes. That's very good. 5 minutes for both.
No problem.
All right, item number 3, the proposed amended rule of 118 for control emissions from refinery flares. Ian?
Good morning.
Good morning.
So I think I have 25 minutes. I'll try to do less than that.
Thank you.
Who's public comments?
Oh, well,
Yeah.
I retract that promise. No. So again, my name is Ian McMillan. I'm a planning and rules manager here at the district. I want to talk today about proposed amended rule 1118 on the control of emissions from refinery flares. Just a little bit of background. The flaring that's occurred over the last 5 years has totaled about 1,200, a little bit less than 1,200 tons of SOx emissions just from those few sources. That's about 3% of the air basin total SOx. That number is probably going to go get revised just a little bit as the emission inventories continue to change, but it's approximately what we expect it to be. What we do know right up front is that there are two key aspects to flaring. First and foremost, it's a safety device. It helps to control combustible gases from the refining process and make sure that they're handled in a safe manner if something happens. Secondly, they do reduce emissions of some pollutants through the combustion of the hydrocarbons. There are many pollutants that come out of flaring, SOx, VOCs, particulate matter, toxics, etc. There's 31 flares that are covered by this rule already. They're operating at 12 facilities, the major refineries as well as hydrogen plants and sulfur recovery plants. Under the existing rule, facilities are required to report detailed categories of flaring, so when flaring occurs and why. They report that to us. What is broken down here is sort of the broad categories of flaring that occur. One would be called essential operational needs. This is when, say, for example, a facility might purge one of their units with nitrogen. That nitrogen makes its way into the flare gas system and then needs to make its way out the flare tip itself. So that would be an essential operational need, or maybe clean service streams. But the majority of the flaring events really are either planned flare events or unplanned flare events. There have been some recent flaring incidents at Torrance Refinery, former ExxonMobil, that I think we've all heard of. Those are shown on that pie chart on the upper portion. But subtracting those, when we look at where's the majority of the flaring events coming from, that's really from these planned events and essential operational needs. Is where most of it's occurring. And there's a lot of these events. Most of them are quite small. Over the 5-year period, it's about 59,000 total events. So most of them are very small. Most of the emissions are captured actually in the very few small, large events. Probably the top 1% is most of the emissions. There are a number of reasons why flaring actually occurs. One is we can look at the capacity of a facility's flare gas recovery system. All refineries have a flare gas recovery system. Part of that is a requirement from the previous amendment to the rule in 2005, but that has a limited size, and so if the gases coming through exceed the size of that compressor, for example, then it will have to make its way out the flare stack. Gases also need to be treated, so the flare gas recovery system, what it does is it takes the flare gases and puts it into the fuel gas system, so it can be used, say, for heaters, boilers, etc. So that some of that gas needs to be treated. The timing of when units go down and go up, so there's producers of gas and there's consumers of gas. So if you have more producers than consumers, then you're unbalanced and you might need to flare, and that can happen for a lot of reasons. One is out of balance. And so these are sort of the main factors for why flaring actually occurs. Each specific incident will have its own cause, of course. One of the key factors that has been discussed in the regulatory community, especially with EPA, is this concept of flare destruction efficiency. So this means when flaring does occur, is that flame actually combusting the product that's coming out in an efficient way. The assumption has long been that about 98% destruction efficiency is what occurs at a flare tip, but it really depends on the conditions at the time. One of the outcomes of some of the studies that EPA has done is found that, for example, the volatile organic compound emission factor that is used currently in Rule 1118 was previously in guidance for EPA. That's been revised about tenfold upward based on some new studies of what happens at flares. Similarly, we have funded our own study here looking at facility-wide emissions at refineries. And I think this has been discussed in maybe in other committees, and looking at the specifically volatile organic compounds. During that study, there was actually a flare event that was recorded looking at sort of the facility-wide, and we went back and spoke with the researchers, and they were able to tease out what was the emissions from that specific flaring event. And this was if you will, a run-of-the-mill flaring event. It wasn't extraordinary compared to the 59,000 other events that were out there. And what was found is that in this table shown there, if we use the existing emission factor from Rule 1118, we found about 244 pounds. And that's what the facility reported, and they reported that correctly. Using EPA's new emission factor, that would bump up to a little bit more than 2,500 pounds from that one event. And using the information from this study, found perhaps 6,000 plus pounds with a fairly large error bar on that. But what we do know is that there are more VOCs coming out of flaring than had previously been known. So making sure that there's appropriate destruction efficiency so that when flaring occurs, it occurs in the most efficient way possible is very important, especially when it comes to volatile organic compounds. There are a number of requirements already for flaring. For example, EPA has their refinery sector rule, and there was a major amendment to this in 2015, some lesser amendments in 2016, this rule covers a number of aspects to refinery operations, but there's about 40 pages of that rule dedicated to flaring. Our rule 1118, which was last amended in 2005, has some significant requirements in it already. In the 2012 AQMP, flaring was included in control measure MCSO3, really because flaring occurs during startup, shutdown, and turnarounds at facilities. When I say turnaround, this is when a facility has a number of units go down, and routine maintenance might be conducted on those units, and then it's brought back online. This happens every several years at refineries. And what MCSO3 said was that we should take a phased approach to rulemaking on 1118 to really gather a lot of information in this first phase, and then in the second phase use that information to see what more could be done to reduce emissions from flaring. I'd like to cover just briefly what is in the existing rule already, and then we'll walk through what some of the proposed amendments are. This is about almost a 40-page rule, so I'm going to try to do it in 2 slides here. The first thing is visible emissions. This is the first thing that everybody sees when flaring occurs: big bright flame, smoke. So visible emissions are prohibited under the rule. There's no combusting event gas except during unlimited operations, so startups, shutdowns, turnarounds, emergencies, and these essential operational needs. But normal, just process venting, that is not allowed to be a flaring event. Specific cause analyses are required, or sometimes they're called root cause analyses, are required for unplanned events if they're over certain thresholds. There is a very unique provision in our rule that's a performance target. And what this does, at the time that it was put in 2005, it was a declining performance target. It's at its final level now. That was set in the 2005 amendment of 1/2 ton of SOx per million barrels of crude capacity that is annually allowed to be flared. And if there is an exceedance of this target, a facility would need to pay mitigation fees. And those fees escalate depending on how much higher they are over the cap. In addition to that, if they exceed the performance target, they need to prepare a flare minimization plan that will describe why they were over the target and what they're going to do to make sure they don't go over the target again. Typically what this includes is if something happened, process unit went down and it caused a lot of flaring, the flare minimization plan would describe historically, okay, here's what happened with that process unit, here's what we're going to do moving forward to make sure that process unit doesn't fail in the same way again. Here are the corrective actions that have occurred. There are certain exemptions to this right now. For example, anything that's really externally caused, a natural disaster, act of war, terrorism, and also externally caused power disruptions. This has come up at the Torrance refinery recently, but other refineries have also run into this problem. There are a number of monitoring requirements already. Facilities must have a plan in place and continuously monitor and record data. The key aspect to the monitoring is that it's occurring within the flare gas system itself. It's looking at the gases that are going into the flare gas system. It's looking at the sulfur content, the flow rate, etc. It's not necessarily measuring emissions once it leaves the flare tip. There are calculations that are done based on the monitoring that's occurring within the flare gas system. And largely this is due to the fact that most flares at refineries, they're elevated, 100 plus feet in the air. They're very hot, obviously, and so putting a monitor up above that is quite difficult. There are some reporting and record keeping requirements, including video and quarterly reports, and there are notification requirements to notify the district of certain flaring events. The district also notifies the public for certain events that are over threshold, and that's through an email system. Okay. I did want to walk through a little bit of what EPA is proposing, what EPA has adopted in their 2015 amendments. Again, this destruction efficiency is really what they're trying to make sure is achieved in a high destruction efficiency. So they look at the heating value of the gases to make sure that they're not doused. For example, oftentimes a flare will have a steam assist system that, well, steam will be blown into the combustion zone to help assist with combustion and to help to reduce visible emissions, to make sure that the flame isn't doused. And so there's some requirements on that to look at the heating value. And that also the flare tip velocity, the gases, the speed with which the gases come out of the flare tip, that stays within appropriate limits. There are also 3 new requirements that cause violations in the EPA rule. The first requirement, if there are 3 events in any 3-year period that exceed either the visibility limits or the velocity limits, that would be a violation. Secondly, if there are 2 events that have the exact same root cause in any 3-year period, again with the velocity or visibility violation, that is also a violation. And then finally, if there is 1 event that's due to operator error, this would also be a violation. Some of this overlaps with the current violations that we have in 1118, but there are new requirements here that EPA didn't have and that we didn't have before. The effective date for this is January 30th, 2019, and there's a number of other provisions in the EPA rule too, but this is the main aspect to it. So what are we proposing? First, again, we're looking at a phased approach, a 2-phase rulemaking. This first phase will have some components in it that we're hoping to build on in the second phase. So in this first phase, we're trying to incorporate key parts of the EPA rule and make sure that the 2 rules are harmonized. We also have a scoping document, and I'll be going into this a little bit more in a few slides here. We have a scoping document that we're asking facilities to evaluate the feasibility of avoiding or eliminating flaring. We are proposing to remove an existing $4 million annual cap on mitigation fees, to update notification requirements, update the VOC emission factor, and to remove some outdated provisions. When it comes to the EPA rule, specifically, we want to incorporate the 3 strikes violations that I just walked through. 3 strikes is a little bit of a misnomer, but it's a common term used for it. And there's various provisions that go along to make sure that that happens, that the violations are measured correctly. We are proposing to incorporate the same limits that EPA has on the heating value of the gases in the combustion zone, and to use the same effective date that EPA has. It's going to take time for facilities to include new monitoring data, and so we are proposing the same effective date. With this scoping document, what we're proposing is really sort of 2 approaches. One is to look at planned flaring events and to look at what are the technical, cost, timing, et cetera, considerations that need to be considered if the target was lowered to 0.1 or 0.05 or 0.0 tons of SOx per million barrels of crude capacity. Again, remember, for all flaring at 0.5, so this would be taking just planned flaring and reducing it down to much lower levels, and to evaluate the feasibility of that on a facility-specific basis. Secondly, for unplanned events or emergency flare events, rather than looking at a numerical threshold, the idea is to establish systems of redundancy so that if an emergency occurs, process unit goes down for whatever reason, what are the systems of redundancy that are there to ensure that if something happens, it doesn't just immediately go to the flare. So for example, if there's a power outage, is there backup power available? Is there steam available to help operate some equipment instead of electricity? Are there a flare gas recovery system, et cetera? And so what are these systems of redundancy that can be put in to ensure that there's at least 3 levels of redundancy if an event actually happens? We expect these documents to be thorough engineering analyses. We're expecting that there could be a role for a third-party technical expert to assist in these reviews. On the annual mitigation fee cap, this has only been exceeded 2 times, both by what is now Torrance Refinery. The first instance that I'll mention, and it's shown here on this graph on the bottom, it was in 2015, that there was the explosion of the ESP, resulted in some pretty non-standard operations at the facility for the rest of the year. That included a lot of flaring, and so there was an exceedance of the $4 million cap in 2015. What's shown in this graph is even higher emissions in 2016. We are expecting there are some revisions pending for that emissions estimate. We're expecting that bar to drop down substantially, and I don't think an exceedance of the cap will occur from what we've heard. The second instance that I'll discuss was in 2013, a bypass line was discovered that went around the flare monitoring system. And this bypass line was thought was in operation for several years, and the flaring was double what was reported to us. There was a significant penalty that the facility had to pay, $14.5 million. That line has been blinded, closed off, sealed, that it's not happening. We've also gone to all the other facilities to make sure that that is not occurring at any other facility, and compliance staff has assured that that is not occurring anywhere else. That said, by removing this cap, we aren't expecting an exceedance in the future of this $4 million cap. With the notification and reporting, right now specific cause analyses are required for planned flare event, or what we're proposing is to have specific cause analyses required for planned flare events when there is an exceedance of this visibility or velocity limit. This is an EPA requirement. This is not currently required in the rule. And then also if there is an exceedance of an emissions threshold during a planned flare event, but that is from non-standard operating practice. We might be told that there is a planned flare event that's going to occur and flaring is going up and going down, and that's expected, but maybe something unexpected happened, and make sure it's not wrapped up in that overall notification to avoid it in the future. We are also proposing to have all notification done through a flaring tool. There's an existing tool that's available now. We will need to update this tool. It's a pretty old system, but what this tool allows is for facilities to notify a single point of contact. It is then emails are distributed to district staff, and then if it's over threshold, it can automatically get distributed to the public without any district input. And then finally, looking at specific cause analyses again for planned startups, where again it's looking to make sure that there's a separation from what is unplanned and what is planned, and doing specific cause analyses for these unplanned events that are captured within a planned event. Separate from the rulemaking, but in a parallel effort, we do want to look at optical remote sensing. There are a variety of different technologies that are available for this. Again, I mentioned earlier some of the studies looking at total facility emissions. This would be looking at just one stack. And the idea is hopefully we can take a single camera, point it at a stack, and say what's going on at that single stack. And this will be looking at emissions, but also at combustion efficiency. That's the ideal case. There are a number of emerging technologies that look very promising on this. What we are proposing to do is to release a request for information from commercial vendors. That RFI would also ask for validation studies to make sure that the technology has been tested before. And if we're comfortable with that, we would then do a pilot study by working with local facilities and installing it, making sure it does what we want it to do. If it looks like there are validation studies that are still needed and that there isn't enough that's currently been done on that, we may want to do a validation study first before we pilot here locally. We have had a number of stakeholder comments. We've had some very productive meetings with industry and community in the last couple of weeks. These slides don't reflect all of that. We are anticipating revised draft rule language being released next week that will incorporate a lot of these comments. I do want to say at the outset that overall the same goals that I've walked through here are still being pursued. It's just how to achieve them. One of the main comments we've heard, for example, from industry is making sure that there is consistency between the EPA rule and what we're proposing, that there aren't conflicts. Makes a lot of sense. We need to make sure that that's done appropriately. And there's a lot of details tied up in that. So we're working on a lot of those comments right now. We have heard from community as well. Obviously, less flaring is better. And I think we've even heard the same thing from industry. Nobody really likes flaring. And so what are the ways to do that? We have heard concerns about the second phase of rulemaking, both from industry and community. Industry wants to see where that second phase is going. It's a little early. We need to do some of these feasibility studies first. And so we're anticipating the second phase of rulemaking to be more comprehensive than this first phase. But we need to do this first phase first to get there. From the community, we've also heard that they want more done right away. And we're doing what we can in this first phase with the information we have available. But we want to move quickly on that second phase so that we can get to that ultimate goal of less flaring and flaring emissions. There were some concerns that have been raised about hydrogen cyanide emissions coming out of the flare stack, and specifically looking at some data showing increased hydrogen cyanide emissions from the total facility at a refinery. There are cyanide emissions coming from other processes. We're not aware, and we've gone back to look at all the literature on this about hydrogen cyanide coming from the flare stack itself. It may be an intermediate combustion product, but there isn't any clear information about cyanide coming out of the stack itself. There is a possibility some of the optical remote sensing will be able to look at this, so we're going to keep monitoring this situation of the science moving forward. Moving forward, we're proposing to bring this to set hearing on the June board meeting. We do have another working group that we've scheduled for May 30th that will discuss this draft, second draft rule language, and this would be going for adoption in July. We have heard some concerns that this is moving a little quickly, but that said, we believe we're very close to, on all sides, of incorporating the comments in a very successful way. So we want to see that process through and see if we can still make July. With that, I'll end my presentation.
Very good. Any board questions?
Of course. I'll jump in. Really, three things. I guess when you mentioned that air toxics are associated with the emissions, my questions are, what air toxics, how much, do we really know? I mean, it could be blowing through catalysts that we have no idea what they are or anything. So do we have a good idea of what air toxics are associated with flaring?
Just in general, the product that's going through flares, it does have some variability. It's generally hydrocarbons, and when you combust hydrocarbons, you get oftentimes other hydrocarbons that are also toxics. Getting details about quantifying what's coming out is pretty difficult. There are some studies that have been done in controlled environments. There are some flare testing facilities where they can actually take samples off of the stack. They have a crane in place and this big giant contraption set up to actually do extractive sampling. And there is some information there about toxics, but that's very controlled conditions. Flaring is a very dynamic situation, so understanding and quantifying all that is very difficult. There may be some possibilities through the optical remote sensing to try to tease some more information out of that. We know
on the VOC side.
On the VOC side, yes, but also looking at combustion efficiency can help us a little bit on that. There have been some studies looking at taking samples during flaring events. Oftentimes that's difficult to take a ground level sample at the time that flaring is occurring in a way that you can actually capture something. It's a very difficult thing to get that. So it's limited information on toxics, but we know that there are some there.
Yeah. Okay. So that's why we want to minimize flaring, because we don't actually know. So the second thing has to do with this issue of the VOC, destruction efficiency. How do we use that calculation in the rule? I don't remember.
So the way the emissions are quantified right now, there's an emission factor that's provided based on the heating value and the flow. And
so
there's an
assumption
assumption
in terms of the emissions.
The emission factor assumes 98%, and that's consistent.
And then that emission calculation is then used for the enforcement.
Yeah.
For annual emission reporting purposes.
For annual emission.
And notification purposes as well as the mitigation fees, et cetera.
It's an assumed efficiency.
Okay. Well, it's better if we have actual monitoring data than relying on emission factors.
Right. Right. So this optical remote sensing is really targeting
If it
that.
can work,
on
we'll
that.
have better data, although obviously the variability associated with it needs to be less, so we can say with more assurance that we're estimating the correct numbers. It's interesting. I don't know what we did the first time around, how we came up with the number that we used.
It came from EPA guidance.
Oh, it was EPA guidance. So they were the ones who were wrong. Okay. All right. I have a lot of issues with emission factors, but I'll leave it at that for now. And the last thing was with regard to public notice. As someone who has signed up for all the flaring public notices, and they come in the email box, and it's a little frustrating because you get it and it says there was a flare, and sometimes the date ranges last for months or for hours. It just says they exceeded some limited threshold, and you're stuck with a lot more questions than you have answers. I think if we're going to revise this, we should really look into providing more information. And maybe it's not available right away. Maybe it requires a follow-up contact with that information, like the type of flare and what, if there was a root cause analysis, what that says. If we have actual emissions estimates, and whether we know if there are any toxics involved. I mean, it just seems like there is more information we could provide. I know we want to get that notice out right away. Maybe what we provide initially is similar to what we do now, but I do think providing more information to the public who signs up would be really helpful.
We are looking at some of that already as part of this. That isn't necessarily This is generally district practice as opposed to what goes into the specific rule language. These are parallel programs that occur with the requirements of the rule, but this is something we're definitely looking at, especially with this web-based notification. It's a really good time to go in and look at these emails. What do they provide? And we have heard other feedback from the community, especially on flaring emissions, getting more data on flaring emissions and specific events. And so that's something that we're looking into.
Thanks. Judith, you had your hand raised.
I just wanted to ask, similar to Joe on this, the emission factor. So the EPA rule that we're following updates to go to this 42, AP 42 emission factor. So that'll be the same, we'll be using the same, whatever you call this, destruction efficiency quotient.
Yes.
Okay, and then we're removing the cap of 4 million. We're not going to replace it with a higher cap or anything like, we're just going to remove it completely because we've only had 2 incidents anyway.
Right.
So that would be, we're not worried about, that it's going to be.
Well, the cap is a financial cap on what they would pay,
Right.
right? So right now, if they're hitting the cap, they're not paying any additional penalties. So the incentive is, if you don't want to pay more,
Do a better job.
do a better job.
Do a better job, right, right. But what I was getting at was there's only been 2 incidents, so we're not likely to see a whole bunch of people going over and we'll have an outcry over how much it's costing refineries.
Right.
Okay. Okay, I think that was all I had.
Supervisor?
The proposed rule has a requirement for a scoping document on avoidance of flaring. Are there best practices from anywhere that sort of help with this? Are they more likely to know or have access to information about best practices? Or I was thinking if we are, this may be a way to help these scoping documents contain, instead of saying, I don't think we can do it,
Sure, and I think we've had a lot of discussions with refineries, both through this rulemaking effort and through the years. Our inspectors are out there a lot. What might be best practice at one facility is not necessarily best practice in another facility. These are very complex processes, and a lot of engineering has to go into this. There are some things that can help. The EPA rule incorporates some of that, looking at combustion zone, looking at how much steam you're providing so that when flaring occurs, how do you handle that situation? But to avoid flaring, there are a lot of different things that can be done. Including the flare gas recovery system and the last rule amendment in 2005 was really key. That was a big one, but it's done, right? So what can we do next? And a lot of this is ensuring that there's good maintenance practices, good management practices that are happening at facilities. But it's in addition to that, how do you balance your flare gas, fuel gas system? And how can you balance that? And that's where detailed engineering comes into play.
Well, I'm certain that they may know these categories, but I'm just saying that often to require something can also help by what you just said, for instance, are 4 ways to approach this.
Is there guidance in the California State Refinery Task Force? Did they look at flaring as part of it?
They do, but not necessarily, they're not necessarily trying to come up with best management practices because, as Ian indicated, each refinery is different. There is not one size fits all approach, but the Rule 1118 establishes the framework that forces them to implement those best management practices for their respective facilities. And if you look at our local refineries and their flaring specifically, and you compare them to other parts of the country, they're by far the cleanest. So we are looking through these amendments to go to the next level. Can we do better? If we can. That's the objective.
Thank you.
Very good. Any other questions?
Just one last thing. I happen to have AB 42 right in front of me. And it says, use of these factors as emission regulation compliance determinations is not recommended by EPA in the introduction. These are the things that drive me crazy because it's exactly what we're doing. So keep it in mind. I know if we don't have anything better, that's what we default to. We should come up with something better. Even EPA recognizes this when they publish AB 42.
I'll just follow up on that. That's why we're pursuing this optical remote sensing. We think that's the ultimate approach that will work for this.
It's very promising.
Very good. Supervisor, you have any questions? Janice? Oh, okay, any public comment on this side? We got a couple. Go ahead and come on up here. Try and stick to 3 minutes. We can stay on schedule here.
We'll rent you a chair.
Yeah. And a binder.
Madam Chair. Good morning. I'm Bridget McCann. I'm manager of Southern California Region for Western States Petroleum Association. So WISP and its members, we truly appreciate the consideration of industry comments by district staff regarding proposed amended rule 1118. However, the preliminary 40-page draft rule was only released on April 21st, and we had 19 working days for highly technical rules in a very short period of time. We really appreciate that staff's worked us into their very busy schedule for 2 meetings. Both of them were very, very productive, and we really had a great exchange of information. We understand that staff, they'll be issuing a significantly revised version later next week, and it'll be prior to the 4th working group on May 30th. So the primary concern for WISPA really is bringing the Rule 1118 into alignment with the EPA refinery sector rule. Currently as drafted, the Rule 1118 would probably create a different set of requirements which in several ways could actually conflict with EPA regulations. So we discussed this with staff. We believe they're really working very hard to address this issue. So planning to work collaboratively and with staff on this really narrow timeline of rule development. We hope we can really resolve our issues in a timely manner so we don't have to ask for additional time to continue working with staff. That's my comments. If there's any questions.
Good.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Come on down.
Hi, I'm Jim Revel with Air Products and Chemicals Incorporated. We operate 2 standalone hydrogen plants subject to Rule 18. I probably have very similar comments to Bridget, so maybe I can trim this down a little, but we're generally supportive of the district's efforts to harmonize Rule 1118 with the EPA rule to reduce flaring and flaring emissions when technically and financially feasible, and also to improve on the community notification awareness for any necessary flaring that would need to occur. And echoing Bridget, we do greatly appreciate the work that district staff has done with us as a stakeholder, both in working groups and meeting individually to try to understand maybe our specific concerns and uniqueness, being hydrogen plants versus refiners. That being said, I think we still feel that there may be some additional understanding that would need to occur regarding maybe specifics around our type of operation at our facilities and ensuring that the rule is crafted such that it's accurate and can be most effective from day one. I think we share some of Bridget's concerns as far as the upcoming probably some significant changes that we've talked through that are going to come through on the rule language, and the ability of us to kind of react to that and have enough time with staff to kind of review that and make sure that that understanding either now exists or what we need to do to follow up to make that understanding a little more clear, so that we're making sure we have the best rule that we can have. I have some examples here, but I don't really need to get into that. I think staff's aware of the examples as far as some of the confusion that we think may exist and some additional work that may need to occur to better understand our facilities. So I guess we just would request that make sure staff has enough time to be able to work with us to understand any of those questions and any of the things that may affect us specifically as a hydrogen plant.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
Good morning. My name is Jamie. I'm an attorney and fellow with Communities for a Better Environment, and we work and advocate on behalf of residents in Wilmington who are cumulatively impacted by 5 oil refineries. And this neighborhood ranks in the top 5% of communities that have the highest pollution exposure and social vulnerability in the state. So this rule will fundamentally affect their health, and we commend the Air District for updating Rule 1118, and including by removing the $4 million cap on mitigation fees, as well as the other great work that the district that staff has put into it. We recommend that we strongly urge the Air District to integrate into the proposed rule a stricter SOx performance standard. Currently, the standard is 0.5 tons per million barrel, but we believe that it should be tightened to 0.1 tons per million barrel. The Air District itself previously considered tightening it to 0.25, and we think that a 0.1 standard is the best practices, and that's what the Air District should push for. The Air District has the authority to set air quality standards and impose penalties for violations of those, and it should exercise that authority to tighten the SOX performance standard. We also recommend the adoption of a VOC performance standard. VOCs are a major problem in Wilmington and near to refineries. A recent study showed that VOC emissions, as was discussed here, were exceeded by 6 times, the actual emissions exceeded by 6 times the reported emissions. This is a major issue, and a performance standard is a successful regulation method that should be adopted for VOCs. We also recommend that flare minimization plans should be required at all facilities. This is what's required in the Bay Area, and it's a preventative approach to pollution reduction. We also have concerns that with clean service flarings, the emissions factors for butane and other such chemicals has been lowballed. We've given specific comments on this to staff. We also recommend that inspections continue to be made to eliminate, to ensure that there are no bypass pipes that avoid flare monitoring equipment like those found at the Torrance refinery. We also recommend that the category of essential operating needs is too generalized. This is not a, it's not given special consideration in the Bay Area rule, and it should be struck from the South Coast rule. Furthermore, the specific causal analysis has a new exemption in the amended rule. That's time. Okay. Well, we'll continue to provide comments to staff, and we thank you for your consideration of this rule, and thank you also to staff for their hard work.
Thank you. Any other comments? All right, that will go ahead and close public comments. Judith, do you have any questions?
I'd just like to ask staff to respond to the comments and requests of the last speaker.
Sure. So we've had a number of discussions with folks from CBE and definitely appreciate their comments that certainly are in many ways on the front line of experiencing what's going on out there. With regards to tightening the standard to 0.1, we are looking at that, but honestly it takes a feasibility analysis before we change any standard. We have to make sure we understand what's feasible and what can and can't be done, and that's what we're doing with the scoping document. It's going to take some really detailed engineering to try to understand it, and that's what we're asking.
So is that something that would come in phase 2?
That's one thing that we're pursuing. We don't know what a target might be in the future, but that's what we're.
But you're doing a feasibility analysis
Exactly.
now.
And now it's to get to that stage.
All right.
Looking at VOC performance standard, it's something we can go back and take a look at. Right now we have a SOX performance standard, and VOC and SOX are often related when it comes to flaring. It's something we'll have to, I think, go back and take a look at.
So do we measure VOCs? Are we doing that?
And the same way we calculate it with an emission factor.
And there's part of the challenge is that we're looking at new technology that seems to be much more definitive in terms of what those actual emissions are. And at least from the initial results, they seem to be higher. But the question then is, can we use it for regulatory purposes? I know that in the past, what we've talked about when we've looked at this technology is we can certainly use it for identifying excess emissions and to reduce those emissions, whether it be from leaks from facilities or other aspects. We can do that right now. But to use it for like inventories and for regulatory purposes, that takes coordination with EPA and recognition of the program in order to basically validate the enforcement actions that would be challenged on some type of technology if it wasn't certified. So we're trying to do this in that phased approach where we validate, demonstrate the technology, hopefully get EPA approval certification, and then have the ability to incorporate it in future rulemaking efforts. So,
Right.
Is that because it's a SIP rule, or because we just like it when EPA pats us on the back?
well, I would assume that you would want this as a SIP rule.
I guess, I mean, may in the end depend upon whether we can reach agreement with EPA. If we have confidence in the technology and EPA doesn't, I could see saying, well, we're gonna do it with or without them.
I think that's an issue that we could address in the future.
Sorry, we think we do want this to be a SIP rule because it does address some of the potential startup shutdown malfunction issues that have come up recently. And
Well, I understand that. I'm just asking a question, really curious.
But it sounds like we are going down that path.
We are
to
going down that
consider a VOC performance standard.
Right.
And we can fashion the rule in a way where a portion of it goes to EPA and to the SIP, and another portion may not be locally maintained if necessary and enforced.
Mhm.
So there are
I mean, we're a long way away, right?
Yeah.
We have to.
Just really briefly,
And the flood minimization.
uh,
Sorry.
he's on top of it.
Yeah.
So on the flare minimization plans for every facility, so right now ours are based on the threshold approach. So a lot of what we're doing right now with this scoping document, it really is a flare minimization plan. What is it going to take to get much lower? And so this is, in many ways, a much more detailed flare minimization plan than is required either by Bay Area, by us, et cetera, by EPA. That's a much more detailed approach. But what is also required under the EPA rule, EPA has its own flare minimization plan requirements under the refinery sector rule due by 2019 for all facilities. So EPA already has that requirement too. It's a little different than maybe what Bay Area does, a little different than what we do, but there's the requirements there. The scoping document ultimately is a much more detailed engineering analysis that goes well beyond any flare minimization plan requirement.
I think one of the issues with flare minimization plans is there's some enforcement aspect to it also.
Sure.
So I think that's one of the things raised.
Sure.
But would there be that enforcement component in the scoping plan? You're looking at it that way.
To the extent that it will be incorporated into the second phase of rulemaking, absolutely. And then also certainly for EPA's flare minimization plan requirements, there's enforceability on some of that as well. We're looking at the clean service emission factors. We're doing some research on that to make sure we have that a good understanding of that. I don't know if Dave wants to talk about the inspection of the bypass lines. Speaking to the inspectors that I've spoken with, they've put their hands on the lines to make sure they know where everything is, and we're sure that.
And that's ongoing, like you don't just do it once and then not do it for 5 years, right? We're kind of following up with that on some regular basis.
Our inspectors are pretty thorough.
Guys.
Yeah, especially with an issue like that. I've been to that refinery once or twice, and each time, that's one of the first things that they talk about. So they're aware of it.
The essential operational needs, we are looking to tighten that, and we've heard their comments. We're exploring ways to tighten it even further than what's already been proposed. The essential operational needs aren't called out specifically in the Bay Area rule, but they, by requiring a flare minimization plan, it can be incorporated in the flare minimization plans in the Bay Area is our understanding. So it might not be called out in the rule, but it might be in the FMPs, whereas we call it out in our rule. But we are looking to tighten that up as part of this rulemaking effort in phase 1. And then lastly, on the specific cause analysis and new exemption, that's just clarifying language of newly proposed language. We're going to clarify.
And then this is coming back, the adoption is July 7th, that
Yes.
meeting. And so you've got from today, a couple of months to work out whatever the problems are with our constituents. It won't go back to stationary source.
We're thinking we might come back actually,
Might come back.
because especially with all the comments you've heard and then new
That's
revised
what I was
language.
thinking, maybe we should come back here one more time before it
That's what I
goes to
like
the board.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That'd be good. And staff feels that there's enough time though at this point to move in the right direction.
Yes.
All right, any other questions, anyone? No? All right. Thank you. On to the next item, the proposed rule 1466. Susan?
Morning. So, proposed rule 1466, a new rule, and to fill a gap in our existing suite of rules, we have rule 1166, which deals with contaminated VOC, soil, And so the toxics associated with some of the petroleum type products, your BTEX would be covered in that rule. And then we have our Rule 403, which is a general fugitive dust rule. And so this rule takes a lot of information from 1166 and 403 and takes some more stringent provisions. And this will be addressing toxic air contaminants that are more of the solid particulate, metal particulate, lead, hexavalent chrome, includes PCBs, arsenic, that could be within soils. So we have had 4 working group meetings to work on this proposal. The structure of the rule is that we want to be sure that we're not overstepping in terms of the oversight agencies that are responsible for the cleanup activities. And so we've worked closely with those agencies to discuss the approach and the proposal, and to allow them to provide the input. And we have a lot of areas where we have alternatives where they can provide other measures that they feel would be appropriate. So the applicability of the rule is that when an oversight agency, US EPA, DTSC, the State or Regional Water Quality Board, identifies that there's a site that contains these toxic air contaminants, and then they start the earth moving activity, then at that point the provisions of the rule kick in. We also have a provision where the executive officer can identify a site, and originally we had a bright line, but through the rulemaking process, we've had another working group meeting and decided to remove the bright line, and we have a set of criteria. So the criteria is that it's a suite of different things that we're going to look at: size of the site, the level of contamination, if there's health risk data available, if we have air monitoring data, consultation with the other oversight agencies in terms of their process. Maybe they haven't designated the site yet. The working group members like this approach better. They were concerned about a bright line, that a bright line could, from the industry's perspective, just automatically bring in a facility that the contamination was so small, it wasn't something that really was something that an oversight agency would have designated, but gives our agency the authority when we need to.
Can I ask a question real quick? Sure. Proximity to vulnerable populations?
Yes,
Okay.
yes,
You didn't say it?
yes.
That's the bright line.
No, just
Yeah.
whether that's one in the,
Yeah.
among the criteria.
Yeah, distance to residents, parks, schools,
Okay,
yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
It's the bright line, I guess.
No, it used to be a bright line.
Yeah, it used to be a bright line. It was based on the California health standards, and so we decided to go with this other type of approach. So this is more preferred, and so that's the structure of the rule now. So the rule does require PM10 monitoring, and the threshold is half of what the PM10 level in Rule 403. Rule 403, it doesn't have an absolute requirement for PM10 monitoring, so this does have an absolute requirement. If they do go over the threshold, they're required to cease their operation, bring it under control with chemical stabilizers. If they can demonstrate they're under the threshold for 30 minutes, then they can start their operations again. So we want to allow these operations to continue. We don't want to impede, but we want to ensure that it's being done in a safe and health protective manner.
And you're using PM10 as a surrogate?
Yes, we're using PM10 as a surrogate for the toxic air contaminants, because we considered looking at monitors for each contaminant. You would need a separate monitor for hexavalent chrome than the other ones, and you have different thresholds. So we decided that the best approach would be to have just an overall PM10 threshold to ensure that the offsite emissions are not going offsite.
And for the toxics, you wouldn't get the real-time feedback either. These can be done on a continuous basis, so you can get that real-time feedback, while a toxic result could take at best 3 days, but 1 or 2 weeks.
And the assumption is, if any of these toxics are in the PM10 particles, we'll capture that.
Right.
We may not know what's in there, but we'll get the particles.
Right.
Okay.
So the rule includes a series of dust control measures. It requires that they put in fencing that has a windscreen. It requires measures for track out. It requires measures for stockpiles and covering stockpiles, for that they're loading their trucks at a minimum loading, and that they have a sufficient freeboard ratio. Also requires that they have a trained dust control supervisor that would be trained under Rule 403. And then we have provisions for schools and early education centers. So there's 2 provisions. The first provision is that they're not moving the soil when kids are present or during school hours. And the second is that they put it into a sealed container. And so we've modified that provision after meeting with LAUSD, is that they wanted to have a threshold in terms of when they could be conducting certain operations. So we added a threshold in there that would be if it's above the hazardous waste thresholds that you can't be moving the soil during school hours. And then the other one was that they wanted the ability to stockpile for no more than 5 days, provided that it was, they're providing a plastic cover. So I'll get into the key issues on that one as we move along. And we do have a provision that allows for other alternative dust control measures as approved by the executive officer. So the first key issue, which is no longer a key issue, is in regards to the applicability for the executive officer, that we received comments that they weren't comfortable with a bright line. So we removed the bright line and we have the set of criteria, which includes distance to sensitive receptors. And then for the second issue in regards to LAUSD, we thought we were good. And we had a working group meeting yesterday. And so LAUSD is saying that they want to be able to move the soil when kids are present during school hours. And so staff's response is that we don't think that's a good idea, and that would be something that we would include in the proposed rule, and then it would be something for the board to decide if LAUSD were to comment. So that's the main issue, remaining issue that we have right now. There's been some other, issues that we discussed in the working group meeting, but staff is working to incorporate those. One from Boeing, they want to see that we have a health risk as another element in the executive officer's decision. We're fine with that. If they have a health risk assessment looking at the fence line concentration and they can demonstrate that there's no impact, then we can consider that too. So we're moving along. The rule's scheduled for set hearing in June, on same schedule as 11/18, adoption on July 7th. That concludes my presentation.
Board comments, questions?
I assume this relates only to on-site control, is that correct?
Yes.
So if they're moving soil in their own area, but what if they're transporting it away? Is that a different consideration from what would include in this rule?
Yeah, in terms of the transport, as there's measures for as they egress out of the site, and there's requirements for the truck in terms of covering the soil. If the soil were to be moved onto another site within our air basin, which I think it can't because it's probably going to be deemed as hazardous.
But the rule doesn't pose those restrictions in preparation for transporting the soil.
No, yeah, it only goes
Well,
up
you
to
said
covering.
covering.
That's it. Yeah, just the covering.
I think
And
DOT
the pre-preparation.
has the
DOT.
actual requirements for
Yeah.
transport of hazardous waste, hazardous materials. And so all of the things that you're referencing,
I
right?
just wonder how this interfaces in a way. Because we're talking about certain kinds of controls, you're talking about covering the trucks.
From my perspective, these kind of issues, let's just say EPA would handle it, or DTSC. So under that, what we're looking at is EPA would consider these, they're called ARARs, applicable, relevant, and appropriate requirements. So in addition to all the requirements that EPA has for a site, these would be local requirements they would also have to consider as they develop their cleanup. And so in this particular case, as a local rule, it would be a requirement for EPA. That same would be true for DTSC. And all those other ones that we're talking about, like DOT, those would still be applicable for the transportation. But it's not where we have specific authority to deal with the transport, the identification, the manifesting, and the record keeping, and so forth.
So what happens now is, DTSC require, or EPA, or the water boards will require them to meet all applicable rules and regulations. And when it comes to resuspended dust at a toxic site, they look at our rules and they see Rule 403, essentially, which is general to all dust.
Right.
This fills that gap that says, wait, if you have toxic dust, the requirements need to be more.
Mm-hmm.
So they will require this of this facility. So like our enforcement rule will have our enforcement rule, but it will also be enforced by all these other agencies.
Well, it gets even more complicated than that, as I experienced last night and to some degree when I went to the Exide Technologies Advisory Committee, because the city of Los Angeles Building and Safety had given permits to just tear down these large cement buildings on a large facility just north of Exide. And didn't consult with DTSC, didn't consult with us, didn't consult with the water board, anybody. And as far as we know, they had no clue whatsoever. And especially the more specific information is that in that direction was where we were always getting the highest lead level readings. And so there were complaints, and we went out, we tested, and actually staff came out and presented last night. It was really helpful. There was some indication that there may have been lead and asbestos emissions associated with the demolition of these buildings. They're now getting ready to grade the soil, and the community is really concerned and outraged. And one nice thing I was able to do was inform the community that we were going to fill this regulatory gap with this new rule. But this, you know, it fell through the cracks here. I mean, and we had some monitoring data, because we're still monitoring at Exide, but we didn't have monitoring data from the facility itself. And it wasn't necessarily the contaminated facility, but it was so close that we could have guessed and known, and I guess it was formerly a canning facility, so it's probably led from that too. Anyway, this is the kind of thing that we're trying to get to. This rule is going to be a little complicated. I mean, that means not only making sure that, you know, DTSC and the water board, we have the data, or if people know that they're supposed to let us know if they're doing something like this, but that building safety and planning departments in the entire district have some clue that this is a requirement. So there's going to be an outreach and education component to this. I think we have to pay attention to. On Exide specifically, there were some issues raised that when we went out and took we went out and actually enforced 403 because there were two violations. We issued two NOVs for violations for the dust outside the borders. But then the community asked, well, did you take samples? And, you know, we hadn't. And so I think that, I mean, maybe this is more of an enforcement issue or something, but I think our inspectors need to be prepared when it looks like it's a significant issue, that not just to write the NOV, but also be, if they're trained and capable, if they could, pull samples of some sort, or have, you know, technical staff come out and start taking samples, because with this facility, the community would really love to know. And because the grading's coming up, it'd be really great if we could get some sampling done out there. But it raised the bigger issue of when we're issuing these NOVs at some of these sites and facilities. In my community, there was a concern about dust and everything when they were cleaning off a building across, you know. And because I'm on next door, you know.
Oh, yeah.
They're emailing you.
I did not reply. They haven't figured that quite out yet.
I think part
But
of the
they did
challenge,
take care of it, but it was just, you know, it's like they didn't have someone out there sampling that would have had to.
I think part of the challenge is, as we learn about these sites, we want to ask these sites to do that type of sampling and give us that type of information. I mean, we have extensive requests to do monitoring all over the basin, and we just can't do it everywhere.
Right, but this
So-
is Exide.
I
I
understand
was telling
that.
people, you know, if this was Flint, Michigan, it would have been on the front page of every newspaper. But yeah, this one might have been an exception.
Yeah.
But is there a way to coordinate? Because we know certain places, like near Exide, that there's lead in the soils around there. We know that. Is there a way to coordinate with activities that might occur in these contaminated places?
We had no way of knowing that they were gonna pull a permit and just, you know,
Well, see,
and
that's it.
demolish the
That's one
building.
thing.
But part of what
kind
we're
of-
doing now is some of that outreach. And Bay, you have some thoughts on that?
Yeah, so one of the things we're gonna do, and again, we only will know if we're told, but if something contains asbestos, they have to give us an asbestos notification if they're doing a demolition.
Right.
And in this case, you know, since it was close to Exide, what I've instructed staff to do is that if we get any notifications, to draw essentially like I think the 1.7 mile
1.7 miles, yeah.
is the radius. So I said to look around 2 miles around Exide, that radius, and if we get any notifications within that, to let us know and to look into it. A lot of the demolition notifications that we get are for really minor things that won't involve anything, and you know so that's one way that we can address it going forward. But you know, I'd definitely love to hear other thoughts and ideas.
I think one of the things that we've been doing with outreach to cities, and see if Derek was here, is, you know, we're letting them be aware of what we're doing on the notice of violation. And we're also letting them know what we're doing with regards to toxics. I think this would be a good example where our geo staff could go out and let people know that if there's demolition activities and they have concerns, to at least notify the South Coast. So we are seeing an increased awareness of the cities and the district. And I think that type of outreach, so that they can, like you said, they issued demolition permit, somebody can just say, hey, maybe you guys need to check the South Coast real quick. That would help
So
us.
it should be not only demolition, but grading in any of these areas that we're talking about.
Any earth
here.
disturbance.
And again, coordinating with the cities, I think as we go to the county and incorporate, it's a good way to kind of, you know, get notification of that something might happen in those areas.
For really large projects, we sometimes get a CEQA document to review, and that can
Yeah.
trigger our, but there was not one on
There's
this
no
case.
CEQA on this one.
No case, no CEQA.
And how are they transmitting this to the district? Is it coming through the regular, you know, 800 cut smog, or is this, you have an email set up for
Someone
this?
complains.
Or
That's just
is it
Somebody next door.
Which part?
the part where you're asking the planning departments to transmit a notice of demolition? Is there a website set up yet, Lockie, where they can do that easily, or is this a old paper form that we're asking them to send in?
Well, this is really
Haven't
on
done
the
it?
cutting edge.
Yeah.
There is no
We'll have to
paper
establish
form.
that process,
Yeah.
yeah.
The asbestos
Maybe-
notifications from the companies doing that is automated. And so
Okay.
we're doing 10 to 14,000 of those through our web. And so that's a much improved system over what we used to do. But in terms of the cities, this is something we're just starting.
Well, maybe a similar process, web-based, that the planning departments could all be notified, hey, if you're doing demolition, if you're in these circles with areas that we know have contaminants, we're interested in when there's a grading permit going on in this area. I have a quick question on the school district. I would understand their idea of wanting to move this stuff if it was just regular dirt movement. But when I look at the list of what's in, and what we're asking them not to move during school hours, that seems like a pretty crazy request to me. I mean, I've been on a lot of school campuses as a kid where there were dust clouds blowing in from construction. And if I thought for a second that that was being done when any of these chemicals were in the dust, really? I'm sort of appalled that they're even making that request.
Yeah. I mean, yeah.
Sorry, but that's.
That's exactly what I said. I said, you know, I have 3 kids, and I said, if they were just doing earth moving, and it was clean dirt, I would be having a fit about it. And this is, you
So,
know,
do they really want the news article to say that these are the chemicals they want to be able to move while kids are on campus?
yeah, it's a,
Okay.
it's a, you know.
Looking forward to that request at the
Yeah,
board
so
meeting.
they can come to the board and make the request.
Okay.
The other thing, when we were talking about samples, the difficulty of taking samples, I don't know whether there's a way to coordinate with our Department of Public Health, because we ask them independently to look at all of these hotspots in our county, of course.
Sure.
Most of them are.
We've got a few.
So I don't know what their sampling might be, but it might be worthwhile to just check with.
Yeah, I think we'll, in terms of the consultation with other agencies, I think we'll put, and we'll add the health agencies too. That's a really good idea.
Yeah, because public health, specifically in our county, is tasked with, you know, all of these these areas, Paramount and Liso Canyon, and so we're having sort of a hotspots report every month, I think.
And Angela was there last night. So.
The genesis of this rule was Exide. I mean, we went into the situation a lot, but definitely Exide was the driver.
Okay. Any other comments from the board? Public comment? Thank you.
I warmed it up.
Very considerate.
You're welcome.
Yeah, need it to.
That's a cooperative agency.
Thanks, David Penner from NRDC. I was at the same meeting that Dr. Lou was at last night about Exide and heard, to me, it's shocking news about what the city was up to without telling anyone. So I was wondering, when looking at the slide about the PM10 monitoring threshold, why are we, it seems to me we're just proposing to monitor PM10. Why not in a site that's right next to Exide? Why would we not also want to, we know there's lead in the soil there. Why would we not want to monitor for lead as well, or at least give the executive officer the discretion to choose whether the substances other than PM10 ought to be monitored?
Well, I think one way we're using the monitoring is to provide real-time feedback. If you look at what we're proposing, if it exceeds the threshold, they're gonna stop those operations and take some precautions so they're not doing it. So with lead, you can't do that. With lead, you're not gonna get that real-time feedback. I mean, we could look at it, it could be in our rule. It's also something we could maybe recommend to DTSC or those other agencies who are looking to do their permitting of the activity. You know, if it was a high-profile case and
You can't trust them to do the job right, that's why I'm here talking.
Yeah.
talking
Well, I
to you.
think we can look at that, but again, you're not gonna get that real-time feedback, and then.
But you could stop, do an immediate stop
Right.
to the issue and then test it for lead after that.
Dr.
You could do that kind of testing.
Because you know there's lead there, so if you have a high PM10 reading, you would think
Yes,
there's probably
But
lead.
there's
Yeah,
probably lead in
concern,
it,
right.
that's right, but I mean, if you really wanna know what's in the sample, and you can test it after you've already stopped the grading or the demolition activity and until, you know
Yeah.
what's in it.
There are-
We certainly have some discretion to do sampling whenever we want, right?
Right.
But would it help the executive officer to have something in the rule that specifies that we might be able to mandate that other people do other testing as appropriate, as determined by staff?
Yeah, I think it was a little too much to require it across the board.
Right.
But obviously, there's situations that would call
Right.
for it, so we
Right.
could think about what those situations are.
Well, the whole point of the monitoring in my mind is to see if they're creating a plume, and if they are, figure out what the problem is with their operations and stop it.
Right.
So that, it's not that we're trying to see what's in the plume, we know the plume could be bad because we're already suspecting these chemicals are there, it's to see if they're creating it, if they're creating it,
Right.
okay, hold on, what's going on? So
Right.
that's the whole point.
So would the executive officer have the discretion, if you see a plume, no matter what's in it, would have the discretion to say, knock it off?
But that's kind of what
Well,
the
then
rule,
we have dust rules and
right.
you have
That-
these other rules that would apply.
So that's what this provision does, it's like, as soon as they hit the 25, they have to stop their earth moving activities, get it under control, and then they can start up again. So, that's, the approach that, we want them to keep going, but we want them to go,
Right.
safely.
And Susan, I think it'd be helpful if you compare it to what's the threshold in Rule 403,
50,
50
yeah.
microgram per cubic meter. And that rule does not require monitoring, so it only happens if there's a situation where it's an ongoing issue, then that monitoring gets required. So this is, they have to monitor, and it's a much lower threshold, and they have to stop if it gets over that until they get it under control. So I understand why you would want to know what's in there, but there's going to be several days or a week delay, and that would be a long time to stop a project
Yes.
at the time. But we
Right.
can do some monitoring.
Maybe if there's a certain number of exceedances or something, something can.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dave.
Oh, good morning, Bill Pierce, the Boeing Company. I'd just like to thank Susan Nakamura and her staff. I mean, they've worked with us on this rule, trying to make some changes that I think help both sides of the table in meeting these requirements. I think we're working on another couple minor issues, or just one issue actually, I guess. We're just looking for the potential to have a higher level for excavations versus what's in the current draft rule of 50 cubic yards. We're looking for a little bit higher value for that. 50 cubic yards is a pretty small excavation, and we're seeking a higher number with, and still following most of the requirements in the rule, just not some of the PM monitoring and signage for jobs that may last just a few days. So it's under discussion, and hopefully we'll.
What volume are you thinking?
We had suggested 500 cubic yards, which is roughly for an excavation, and that's roughly like something that would occur in about a week's time. So versus, and again, I think we recommended following all the requirements in the rule except for the signage and the monitoring. So that's for a very short-term project. It's just a lot of setup and everything for something that's short-term.
So
And excavation only, not grading or anything else, just strictly excavation.
So I think this number is right. So 50 cubic yards would be about 2.5 trucks.
Right, close to 3 trucks depending on
3 trucks.
choice, yeah, so,
And then 500 would be 25 trucks.
yes.
So the 2 trucks, like you're saying, is a fairly small project,
Yeah, that's like a morning, so.
but as we say, you could do that within half a day.
So that's what, we're just looking at it, trying to find a more reasonable, I mean, just what we thought was maybe more reasonable for these small. Yeah, I mean, we're doing a relatively small excavation in the next week or two. That's, I mean, the square footage is less than this room, but it's about 150 cubic yards, and so it's just.
And are you taking into account, for instance, proximity to sensitive receptors?
Well, so
Would there be like a sliding?
Yeah, so what we had discussed is that the applicability right now, when an oversight agency identifies a site that contains the materials, the toxic air contaminants, that they want to have a criteria similar to where the EO designates the site, so proximity, the size of the site, that gives them a little more flexibility to take certain measures that are in the rule off the table in terms of what they're going to require, and we were in agreement that the oversight agency could do that. So I think that, you know, we'll work
I
with
think
the
we're on the
Boeing
path.
issue, yeah,
So.
so.
Thank you. Thank you. Any other comments? We'll hear from the school district to rebut them.
Not yet.
One down. All right, any other comments? Nope. Janice? Nope, okay. All right, we have our attached written reports. There's my presentation summary. Other business? Any other business members? Any public comment for items not on the agenda? No one jumping up for that? All right, with that, we will go to the next meeting on June 16th. 15 minutes early. Done early.